What is going on, everyone? So it is time for my film reveal video. This is when I take a look at my film on the light box here. Typically I record these videos just after I return from the trip when I see the film for the first time, but my fall trip, it's a little tricky because I have a lot of work to do afterwards in terms of producing the zine and the print portfolios. So this time I went through and I already scanned all the film, I edited everything already, and now really is just a matter of looking at this film, sharing it with you, talking about the compositions and some of the stuff behind it. So it's not as much about the initial impression, it's a bit more about just my thoughts on the images, given that it's been a couple months or so since I took them. So let's take a look at the film. All these photos are going to be taken on Fuji Pro V100. This is the first scene I photographed. This is the pine cones with the damp saturated pine litter there. I took a photo with and without a warming filter. This is the version with the warming filter, which did not help on the scene. It really did not need it. But I'm still in the phase of sometimes it's good to see how it is with and without. With the warming filter, obviously it gets a little too warm, but I think that also makes it a little bit more contrasty as well, which is not a great thing for this scene because it's already plenty of contrast as is. Here is the version without the warming filter. I really like how this turned out. You have some of the natural cool tone and some of those really dark pine cones there. What I really liked about the scene is these light colored pine needles against the dark colored pine cones, and then the ones that are a little bit more fresh turned quite reddish. So it's this really nice movement within the scene. And while composing this, my goal really was just to frame a very uniform area. And so it's a pretty big area, so it's pretty easy to do. But I really do like the way this one turned out. It printed very, very nicely. All I really had to do was just work with the dark tones a little bit just to lessen the contrast of the image just a little bit. But really, really happy with how that one turned out there. This is the dead Manzanita that I photographed also on a bit of a rainy morning. And this one turned out okay. I'm just not really in love with it. There's some awkwardness, and it's something I was very well aware of while I was composing it. But essentially you have this cluster of dead Manzanita, this cluster. I'm trying to find a way of having them fill the frame there. Again, you have those dark pine cones from the saturation from the rain. I like the subject matter. I just am not completely, I'm not in love with the composition, we'll put it that way. So maybe at some point I'll find something that works a little bit better. But what that photo did is it gave me something to do that morning when otherwise it was a little tricky from a photography standpoint. Then I photographed this scene, and this is the natural orientation of the subject. This right here is a little bit more of what I had in mind. So this is a cottonwood leaf that fell from the tree above and it landed in the bark there. So I didn't place it there, it was placed by the wind. I do like this and this. I like the diagonal emphasis. The only thing is that this is really pushing the limits of my camera and my lens. To take a close-up photo like this, you have to keep extending those bellows further and further and further. What happens is that for certain subjects, when you're at a certain distance, as you continue to extend those bellows further and further, allowing you to focus closer and closer, the close focusing distance you get in this no man's land where the only way to focus is to move the whole camera backward and forward. On my previous camera, my Arca Swiss focused with the rear, which doesn't really have an issue with this. But I just wasn't able to quite get everything in focus, and there's gonna be some direct light coming. So I'm not particularly in love with this. When I scanned it, it's not super sharp. But this is a theme I'd love to pursue on future trips. I do like the cottonwood leaves, I like the bark, but I just didn't quite pull it off with this one. This is the Ponderosa stump flanked by maples. I took this a little bit earlier because I wanted to see how it looked when there's a little bit of direct sunlight in there. And my exposure is pretty decent. I'm getting a little dark in here. It's okay. Now, those of you who either have the zine or the print portfolio, or if you had a careful eye in the video, you might notice that I actually flipped this one. This is not the way I used it. I actually used it this way as a photo because to me, this kind of led into the subject a little bit better. Having a little bit more space here, a bit less space there, seemed a bit more natural. This way, it felt a little off balance. So I did choose to intentionally flip this one. Next, I'll show you the version with the more so the light I was going for. With transparency film, you have a very limited dynamic range. And so here you can see into the darker areas a lot better. You have more detail. And this might be a safety photo. I mean, it's a good photo, but I took several more of the scene as well. And again, this is going to be how the scene actually looked. And I just felt it looked a little unbalanced. So I chose to present it this way. One of the fun things about shooting large format is that it's very easy to, when you put a piece of film down on the light box, well, upside down, certainly, but it's very easy to kind of see it either way and sometimes accidentally. And so sometimes I'll put a film down, I'm like, oh, that looks great, and then I flip it the right way, I'm like, oh, it's not so great. But yeah, so basically the exact same scene, slightly different time when I photographed this one as the light was changing a little bit. But I really do enjoy the visual contrast between the dead Ponderosa trunk, all the maples, and it's kind of an imperfect mix of maples. I like how they interact with the trunk. They kind of reach around the front of it, so it's adds some more depth to it. And while composing this, I was paying attention to how much room I had down here versus up there, trying to find that proper balance. And I am quite happy with how this one turned out. Also, another thing I'll mention is that because of all the rain that had happened in the few days prior, the wood in here is very saturated and dark, and also down here is very saturated and dark. I think that's what helps this trunk stand out, because if this was a normal year, if this was all dry, you'd probably have, you wouldn't have a lot of visual contrast between this trunk and all the really light colored sand down there. So I think it was the mixed fall color combined with all the saturation that made this subject work really well in this year. Past years, I had a hard time finding a way to photograph it. And then here is the maple, and I'm not really in love with this one. Again, it was something that day for me to point my camera at, but yeah, I'm not really all that drawn to it. It has some elements I like in terms of a little bit of a directional emphasis of the branch here, the cool colored sandstone, the moss there, but it just, I don't know. To me, it just lacks appeal, but it was enjoyable to at least get the photo set up. Here's another variation. I can't remember, I may have used a warming filter for this. I probably did. But also what was happening that morning is that there were some clouds up in the sky, and the sun was kind of behind the clouds and it wasn't. But this is certainly pretty dramatic. Between the two, I do prefer this to the other one. If you take a look at them there. And I can't remember, but with this dramatic of a color difference, I suspect I put a warming filter on it. And that's what the difference is with this one. Definitely a lot more natural. And in this scene, it was a lot of blue sky overhead was the light for it. There's a little bit of clouds, but it was mostly blue sky. This one I was a bit disappointed with. Clearly my exposure is too dark. And I suspect that was a result of, there were some clouds overhead, and it was getting darker and then brighter, then darker, then brighter. Not so much that you say to yourself, hey, it's fully sunlight right now versus it's shade, but enough where when working with transparency film, where a third of a stop makes a pretty big difference, by the time I metered the scene and was ready to photograph, it got a little bit darker. I really do like this composition. I was trying to balance this element right here and have it so it flows through. This one flows through. I got a little bit of stuff in the background that isn't necessary, but I think this is one I definitely want to try again with. Maybe move the camera down just a little bit, get a little more right down here. But I was really bummed that this one was too dark. And it's not like digital where you can just bump up the exposure and everything's fine. If you scan this and you try to bump up the brightness, you get some really weird things going on, and you just lose the nice tonality. So that's definitely one I'll try again, and I was bummed, gotta admit. This scene with the living Ponderosa, the standing dead Ponderosa, and there's a dead Ponderosa back behind the Manzanita there. I think it was last year in particular that I noticed the potential of this, because this tree right here used to be standing like right here, and it was a distracting element between them. And so when I saw that this tree fell, then I knew that there was some potential with this subject. This is my safety photo. This is before the light warmed up and got better. But I didn't know if it'd get windy or something, so I wanted to at least get that safety photo out of the way. So this one, it's a bit on the cooler side. The light isn't quite as ideal. But what I really liked about the scene was I liked this reddish band here, which moves across diagonally. I like how the tree leans into this one. I was very careful with my camera placement so that there was a bit of interaction between these two trees, but not so that the branches really started intertwining too much. There's a little bit of distracting elements over here, a little bit over here, and I was, with the focal length that I had, I was just trying to find the best place to camera. I knew that I'd have to crop in a little bit, and there's also a little bit up there. But I have some other ones with a little better light, but I really do like the subject matter. Something about the dead trees. Here's one where I probably used a warming filter on it because it's a little warmer back there without the light being dramatically warmer there. Now, one thing I've noticed, which is interesting, is that Provia does quite well with the really bright areas. I mean, I had some of these areas at like positive 1.8 or so. I could have gone higher, honestly. It doesn't really like the shadow tones being darker than -2, but you can push those highlights even higher. But overall, I'm pretty happy with how this one turned out. I have some other variations of this one as well. Here's one without the warming filter with a little bit better light than the first variation. And again, just a little bit of madness in the foreground. I think I focused probably on these branches back here. This in the background are in focus. I'm a little out of focus here, but it doesn't really matter for a scene like that. But certainly very happy with how this one turned out. All right, next up is the scene with the very interestingly eroded rocks here in the reflected light. And while I was metering this scene, I was paying close attention to the dark tones in the shadow areas of the rock here because I want to make sure that didn't get too dark. In reality, I could have gone a little brighter on this one, though I have all the detail I need. Now, when I photographed this last time, the film I had was compromised, and what happens is the dark shadow areas got kind of muddy and like reddish, and it made it so you scan it and there's nothing really to work with. And so I was able to play with it a little bit, but it wasn't great. So I was very happy to return to the scene and to photograph it with good film. Now when setting up the composition, I was paying close attention to this line and this line right here. I didn't want either of them to go to the corner. So you notice that this one kind of comes up and curves up, and this one goes just shy of the corner there. I was paying attention to this space there, that space there, and then I like the alignment of the rocks. And if you look, if you were to connect a dot between kind of all these rocks here, it essentially does something like this. So you have a pattern a bit like this and a bit like this. Again, avoiding those corners. This is taken during a moment of some really nice reflected light. Get that nice warm light coming in from one side, the cool light from the sky on the other side. So you have the blue shadows there from the sky. But very happy with how this turned out. A little bit of front tilt to get pretty much everything in focus. And it was a very calm day, so I wasn't battling the wind. But I was very happy to finally get that on film. I'll have a couple of variations. This one appears to be maybe a slightly brighter exposure. But again, we get that nice warm light, plenty of detail to work with. And to me, it's pretty fun to think that these rocks tumbled down a slope, up over here, and they've been sitting here for who knows how long. Thousands of years easily. Longer than that perhaps, just sitting there undisturbed. And this is in a part of the park that is not frequently visited by people. And as a result, even some of the smaller rocks may have been sitting in that same spot for a very long time. And when I returned to this scene, comparing the previous version to this version, pretty much all the rocks were exactly as they were before. So I just think that's kind of cool that a rock can be sitting there undisturbed for hundreds, thousands of years. So, pretty cool subject. I think I have one more of that. And then this one, I feel like maybe the light is a little less intense than the first one. The window of reflected light on this scene is substantial, but when the sun is hitting the slope just out of view, and when this is all nicely in shadow, that's when the light's best. But then at some point the shadow starts creeping up higher and higher and higher on that slope. And so the source of reflected light gets less and less and less. But very happy with how that turned out, and it is very sharp. I took this photo after going for a bike ride, and it was later in the day. It was maybe 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock or so in the afternoon. And I decided just to head down into the washes with my camera, see what I could find. And it didn't take long for me to find the subject. So what I really liked about the scene was the mixed color of the tree here, where you have some warm and some cool tone. This is an ash tree of some sort, I believe. But I also liked how it's set against the wall with the darker, lighter, darker areas. And so trying to find a composition for this one was really tricky because I didn't want these bands to be too predictable in a way, and also wanted to frame the tree just the right amount. The tree ends just after that leaf right there and that leaf there, so I intentionally chopped those off so it extends slightly beyond the frame, which I think is better visually. And then also it extends just a little bit out the top there. So by chopping just a little bit of it, you give the impression that that tree just keeps going and going and going. Now afterwards, when I was looking at this on the computer, I found something that was quite fascinating. If you look at these patterns in here, they look like they're petroglyphs, but they're not. That's just natural erosion of the stone. But it almost looks like there's like a dude there holding like a bow and arrow, and looks like there's like animals and stuff. So, I thought it was really fascinating how the more you look at it, that sort of texture there does complement the leaves. And also you have this visual contrast between the leaves, the stone. This one was pretty easy to work with on the computer. I did take away some of the muddiness because it's a little bit of a yellowish tint overall to the image. So I took down the yellows a little bit, which brought out a little bit more natural color separation by enhancing the existing blue tone a little bit. But this is actually one of my favorites from the trip, and it's one I just happened to stumble upon. And it was a tricky one to compose. Same scene, just took a double just because those leaves would just float a little bit in the wind. I wanted them to be as steady as possible. I think both of them are pretty equal in that regard. But very happy with how that turned out. It looks beautiful in print. This one I didn't really do anything with in the videos. This was on a day when I was trying to find something, anything to point my camera at and take a photo. It was the first time on this trip that there was some good sunlight, some good reflected light. I saw this little Utah serviceberry up here and decided to set up my long lens. It's okay. To me, it's just a little bit of a muddy image. There's just a lot of this sort of mid-tone, and it's not compelling enough for me, but technically it turned out fine. The wind cooperated, the exposure is good. To me, it's just a little bit blah. I have some other photos within Zion that have some of these little bushes or trees sticking out of the walls that I like a lot better. But it was a fun exercise for the time, and it was nice to actually have some reflected light after several days of storm. And then here's another variation of that. Basically the same thing. All right, up next is the photo of the roots. I found this scene while wandering along the washes, and it was certainly the root that caught my eye, but I also really liked how this rock was kind of nestled between those two sections of the root there. The sand in the foreground had this really nice velvety texture from all the raindrops. And there was one very large distracting element that I was working around, and that is that there's this really big rock over here. And if you look at the scene on sort of a greater scale, this rock had more visual emphasis than this right here. And so I knew I needed to include it, but it was a matter of trying to move through the scene and try to find the angle where I could chop that rock off, and it has a very similar visual weight to some of the other rocks. And actually the fact that it's a little bit darker here is beneficial, because this rock, even though it's on the edge of the frame, has less visual emphasis than this one, because this one's brighter. And so that was my first decision when composing this. Then as a matter of how much foreground I wanted to include. And typically I would probably stay away from having this root going right so close to the edge there. But that's just fine because I had enough space here. And then trying to balance this shape within the composition. So quite happy with how that turned out. It was interesting because you see that the fallen leaves back there are mostly quite green. And had this been a subject I pursued a little later in the trip, when there was more of, or during a year with more usual fall color, you'd have a lot of orange leaves in the scene. I think that would be a bit overwhelming for the subject. So I like the refreshing color palette of the greens up in there, and it really allows the root to stand out. Now I did take a photo with and without a warming filter. I can't really remember which one it is I scanned. It was probably the one with the warming filter, but this is, I believe, without the warming filter, and then this is with the warming filter. And this one to me actually looks a bit less interesting. And I'd have to go back to see which one I scanned, but I may have scanned this one and then cooled it down a little bit, because even though this one's a little less accurate, there's something almost kind of refreshing about the cool tones in there. So I don't know, maybe I did scan this one. I really don't remember, but usually if I have a version with and without a warming filter, it's a no-brainer that the warming filter especially since this was a scene that was lit mostly by blue sky. But that's also shows why I go with and without it, because sometimes you never really know. So I really do like the cool tone on that one. But again, I may have scanned this one and then cooled it down a little bit to get something in between the two. But overall, I'm quite satisfied with how that one turned out. All right, up next is this ash tree that I photographed a little further up the wash. Now this is a tree that I've walked past this tree so many times through the years. And on a typical year to Zion, when I go there for fall color, these ash trees, they turn color before the other trees. So usually this one is very sparse in leaves up top, and there's just a bunch of brown leaves down below, which is always very visually interesting. But it was interesting being there on this trip because I had an opportunity to photograph it while the leaves were still there, while the washes were still pretty clean. And for those of you that watched the video when I photographed this, you probably saw that I was setting up my camera when this tree was all nicely backlit, and then all of a sudden I'm there taking a picture of it in this relatively drab looking light in the video. Well, the day before I photographed this, I actually stood at this exact same spot and with my iPhone took photos as the light was changing through the whole scene when it was a backlit tree to just a little bit of light, and looked at all those photos. And I found that the subdued light was the best for the subject. That's why I didn't bother photographing it when it was backlit, because it was just a little bit too busy. And so this is also a scene where Provia does very, very well. So I have a couple different variations of this. When composing it, I was trying to make sure I have enough room down here. And then I was just trying to balance all the various elements. This amount of leaves over here, this amount of leaves over here, the top, bottom. And I just found something that worked. But these trees, I mean, you can see this tree has a bit of a tortured existence. This one just gets pulverized by flash floods, yet it's braced up against this slope of sandstone here. And so the trees in those washes have a lot of character. I'll have some other variations of that and some different lighting. This is a little bit of a warmer lighting. You see there's a little more of a, almost a little bit of a magenta-y warm tone on the trunk there. That's really what I was going for when I was setting up for this one. And so I basically was just waiting for the tree to no longer be in sunlight. And then as the sun was continuing to drop over off to the right, the shadow kept expanding further. And there's just a big wall of orange sandstone over here that was going to reflect into it. And so that's the light I was going for. But the color contrast between the yellows and the greens and then sort of the blues, very cool subject. And then another one, I believe this is one where I threw a warming filter on. And I don't really remember which of these ones I scanned. I usually put like a little piece of tape on it after I scan it, which I think this is the one I did scan. I see a little bit of tape residue on the sleeve there. And I think this was taken a little bit later on when the glow was still good, but I was trying to minimize some of the blue tones. So warming filter on this scene seemed to do the trick. These organized a little bit here. All right, we're getting down to it. This is a scene I photographed in the past I wasn't too happy with, but this time it worked out pretty well. I think in the past I used a 300mm lens. I used a 240 this time. I included more of the foreground, which I like because you have this neutral tone here to balance out the warm tone and the cool tone. I used a warming filter. I think these are like 30 or 40 seconds for the exposure times, and the maples were absolutely calm, which was wonderful. I focused on the tree. In years past, I focused between these branches and the tree to try to get both. I didn't get anything in focus. So this time I said, I'm not worried about these. The tree is the most important thing I focused on there. I'm quite happy with how this one turned out. And it's really nice to have a subject that you try several times. This was my third attempt on this one, and I finally got the photo I was going for. So very happy with that. I'll have a couple different variations of that scene. Another one, basically identical. Just when you have exposures that are this long, a subtle little breeze can go in there when you're not paying attention, and all of a sudden you have some blurred leaves. So very happy with how that one turned out. And also when I was framing this one, it's a matter of giving it enough space there, mostly centering it, and just being mindful of the area up top. But that one is pretty straightforward. And then another variation. They're all basically the same, just making sure that I didn't have any wind motion in them. This one I could have exposed a little brighter. This would be the proper reading of this one. It was tough to meter because I was trying to find a backlit leaf where I can meter as a reference point. I probably could have been about a stop brighter or so, but it's okay. What I was really bummed with is that a little bit after I photographed this, there was going to be a moment when there was a shadow of a Ponderosa that would sweep over, and these leaves are very spotlit in a very interesting way. And so I was waiting for that to happen, and then basically clouds came over, and then wind knocked off that leaf, which was one of my favorites. But it's a scene I'll try again next year if I have an opportunity to do that. Really tricky scene to photograph. Definitely more in the experimental category. And this is another scene that I have tried to photograph many years and have not been successful, but this year it turned out fine. So I was really just trying to balance this with this and trying to have it where you have enough of this overlapping the tree and this, because it's very easy to have a composition where it's a third, a third, a third. And to me, that really wasn't, it's too predictable in a way. But by including more of this wall here, because I love the fact that this tree is peeking out from around the corner. And you have the visual contrast between these light, colorful leaves and then the cold stone. I'll have a couple different variations on this one. Now, in terms of focus, this branch right here is not going to be in full focus, but everything else is. And it's because I have a little bit of swing set so that the plane of focus kind of follows the wall there and that and that. But I did have to sacrifice a little bit of that. But it did scan beautifully, and I just love the visual contrast of that. Here's another variation, probably with a warming filter. The other one may have had it as well. But it's at the limits of what Provia can handle. But I was metering some of the dark moss here for the dark areas, metering the bright areas there, averaging it, making sure everything fell within range. But certainly quite happy with how that one turned out. Getting down to it. A little bit of a brighter exposure. This is probably the one I used. I don't remember what the differences were in them, but you can see how I'll have a little more to work with in the shadows there. So this is probably the one I scanned. Provia is pretty forgiving, and so higher contrast scenes like this, if I were to photograph this on Velvia, which is not in existence anymore for large format, but it would have been too much for it. But this gave me all the detail I needed. But very happy to finally have that one. This photo I did not show in the videos. This is the last photo I shot on my final full day there. There's some interesting color there, created an interesting shape. These scenes with the rocks and the leaves, they're hard because it really becomes two separate photos. You don't have a lot of subject interaction between them. I thought for sure I had overexposed this, but looking at it now, I'm like, no, I could have actually been a little brighter up there. But the problem in Zine is that, especially with slide film, when you expose for the rocks really good, this will be a bit too dark. If I expose properly for this, this will be too bright. There's just a really big difference between those. It's okay. It's not, it's a little too 50-50 for me. And then the final one's just another variation of that. A little brighter exposure. This one's a better exposure. but to me, it's just not super compelling. Plus also when I was photographing this, there's a bunch of people coming through the wash. There are kids shouting and screaming and throwing rocks and stuff like that. So it takes me out of the moment a little bit. But overall, I'm quite happy with how it turned out. It was enough work so that I can split the work between this year's zine and print portfolio and next year's zine and print portfolio. That way I can start everything in the fall, end it in the spring, and then I can work on all this sort of stuff during the summer months, as opposed to that really brief window between my fall trip and my winter trip. But I want to thank everyone for watching, and we'll see you around next time. You may have noticed this video has no ads and no sponsors, and I think it's nicer that way. If you enjoy this ad-free and clickbait-free content and want to help me live my dream, a voluntary contribution through PayPal or by joining my Patreon helps keep my gas tank full and my film freezer stocked. You can find more information by visiting my website at benhorne.com/donate. I also have prints, ebooks, and my annual portfolio is available on my website. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you around next time.